Hi everyone. Sorry it's so weirdly dark and shadowy. Plug in my microphone. All right, so we're picking back up again with Kant and the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. So we've gone through the metaphysics, and we are now in a position to understand the core ideas of Kant's ethics. So let's do a sort of general overview of Kantian ethics, and we'll have opportunity to talk more about this in next week also. So Kant is going to be generally in opposition to utilitarianism and virtue ethics. And so I made a point of showing the similarities between utilitarianism and virtue ethics. And Kant is going to be something else entirely. What is really going to set Kant apart is the idea of a moral law. This is the cornerstone of Kantian ethics. The idea that there is an absolute moral law, that the right thing to do is not determined by the situation, not something that can be calculated according to pleasure, but is instead something which is rationally dictated and is unchanging. Which is to say that the right thing to do is the right thing to do in every circumstance for every person. So, the absolute moral law, right? Where will this come from? The moral law is, for Kant, the rational law. Kant's ethics is an attempt at a purely rational ethics, that being ethical and being rational are essentially one and the same. And therefore, right, they are not going to change according to the situation. All right. So Kant begins, I guess we'll walk through the text here. Kant begins the groundwork by digging into this distinction between the realm of appearances and the realm of pure reason, or between pure reason and the physical world. So on page 1, he writes, there are two kinds of rational knowledge. Material knowledge, which concerns some object, and formal knowledge, which pays no attention to differences between objects and is concerned only with the form of understanding and of reason and with the universal rules of thinking. Now, two kinds of rational knowledge. One has to do with matter, the physical world, and one has to do with that which is purely formal, with universal rules of thinking. So, the moral law is going to have to do with the latter, right? With formal knowledge. A law is a form. And so to know the moral law is to have some kind of formal knowledge. And formal knowledge pays no attention to differences between objects and is universal. Right? So this is a distinction between the empirical and the pure. And already we can see that because ethical knowledge, knowledge of the moral law, is going to be formal, that it can't have anything to do with anything physical. it is not concerned with objects. It's not concerned with the physical world. And so this is already strange and reminiscent a little of Plato, but really no one else. Right? For both Aristotle and Mill, ethics obviously is about the material world, the physical world. It's about what we do, how we act in the physical world. It's about how we feel in the physical world. Right? And so this raises an important distinction. Not just that Kant is not concerned with the particularities of any situation, as both Aristotle and Mill are, but that, right, as we said just a moment ago, the moral law is formal and therefore universal. So if we go back and think about those utilitarian scenarios, right, is it ever permissible to, kill someone in order to save some more lives, right? Do you kill one person to save 5 lives? For utilitarian, the answer is obvious, right? Yes, of course. Right? 5 deaths is calculatively worse than 1 death. Kant is going to say, no, you should never disobey the moral law. Regardless of the situation, what you do has to be in conformity with the moral law, and if it isn't, then it is unethical, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the act. And so not only is Kant not concerned with the particular, he's not concerned with consequences. And so we return again to our tripartite structure of an act. We have motive, act, and consequence. Right, for Aristotle, motive and act were important. For Mill, consequence was important. For Kant, consequence is not important. The only thing that really matters is the motive, right? And we'll see why in just a minute, right? But so we can mark down Kant as being interested in motive, not in consequence when evaluating an act. Right? So in making this distinction between the empirical and the pure, Kant also wants to make a distinction within ethics. And so I'm looking at this quote from page 2, where he says, "We need a metaphysics of nature before real empirical natural science, and a metaphysic of morals before practical anthropology." All right, so what he's distinguishing here is essentially the theoretical from the practical. I need to have a metaphysical theory of nature before I can do any real empirical natural science, right? So I need to, for example, have a theory like causation. Right? In theory, I believe everything in nature happens because of causation, and happens according to the law of cause and effect. Right? I have a formal understanding of nature. Right? Form means it applies in every case. In every case, nature behaves according to cause and effect, the law of cause and effect. Once I have that theory, then I can go out and do empirical natural science, right? What causes the bear to hibernate? What causes the deer to choose one mate rather than another? Right? So I have to have that formal theoretical knowledge before I do any empirical observation and have any particular ideas, right? Particular ideas about the deer or the bear. And then he goes on, right? So, in a metaphysic of ethic, of morals, before a practical anthropology. In the same way, I need to have a theory of the moral law, a theory of the form of morality, before I can do what he calls practical anthropology. And this is a term that he uses throughout this text, but especially in the opening pages, to make this distinction between pure morality, or the moral law, and mere anthropology. That is to say, a moral theory, a universal morality that is going to be valid in every circumstance, and then mere anthropological concerns. He goes on to say that in order to find this pure morality, then, morality must be, quote, cleansed of everything empirical. To understand what morality is, pure morality, to grasp this moral law, we have to abstract morality from everything empirical, from everything anthropological. We cannot think of ethics in terms of anthropology. First, we have to understand if there is such a moral law, and then what it is. Right, so he goes on page 2. It is utterly necessary to construct a pure moral philosophy that is completely freed from everything that may be only empirical and thus belong to anthropology. That there must be such a philosophy is self-evident from the common idea of duty and moral laws. That this is possible is evidenced in our experience of duty. And we'll talk about duty again. And our idea of duty and our experience of moral laws, right? So, for example, I feel that duty to not kill someone. This relates back to our discussion again of utilitarianism. Why I would hesitate to push the large man over the bridge, maybe before I would hesitate to pull the lever to kill the person on the other track. Right? That experience, I should not do this, Kant thinks is evidence of a moral law, right? That feeling of being compelled to do something, an imperative not to do something. So he goes on page 2. Everyone must admit that if a law is to hold morally, i.e., as a basis for someone's being obliged to do something, it must imply absolute necessity. That the command, you are not to lie, doesn't apply only to human beings, as though it had no force for other rational beings, and similarly with all other moral laws properly so called. All right, so this is interesting, right? That he's saying the only argument for a moral law is that it is necessary. Why follow the principle of utility? Well, you should, right? And Mill, as I mentioned at the end of the video, Mill relies on a sense of duty also. But what Mill can't do is claim that the principle of utility is based in pure moral law, in pure reason, right? That it is absolutely necessary, right? He can't assert this necessity. He never says it is necessary to follow the principle of utility. Just that if we want to be happy, if we want a good society, we should. Kant wants to say something different. He wants to say that if we understand the moral law, we understand that it is necessary. And what is going to make it necessary is, the structure of reality, the structure of subjectivity, and the place of reason within reality. So refer to the last video for a little bit of that. But in essence, that We must follow the moral law because the moral law is dictated by pure reason, and pure reason is that which in the first place makes reality what it is and makes us what we are. Now, the reason why it's necessary then is if we want to be real, that is to say, if we want to be something more than an appearance, if we want to activate ourselves as the things that we are in ourselves, not simply as appearances that are a part of the physical world, then we have to act according to pure reason. Whenever we don't act according to pure reason, we are not being rational agents. We are not being what we are, but more, we aren't real. We are simply effects of nature, effects of the physical world. In order to actually be, we have to follow the moral law. The only chance we have to be real is to follow the moral law, because the moral law is the only thing that has the possibility of interrupting, of having efficacy, having power within nature itself. Right? I mentioned in the last video about Kant that the world as it appears to us, nature as it appears to us, is always defined by causation. Therefore, everything that appears will appear to be caused. It's not clear how we ourselves can interrupt that chain of cause and effect without just being ourselves effects of some cause. How can we interrupt that chain of cause and effect as a cause independent of any cause within the physical world? We can only do that. We can only have true freedom and agency by acting according to pure reason. Because remember, pure reason is in the first place that which organizes the natural world so that it appears to follow the law of cause and effect. Meaning that when we act according to the moral law, we are acting as that force which in the first place organizes the natural world. Whenever we act not in accord with the moral law, we are mere appearances being acted upon. We are effects of nature. So if we are ever to have agency, if we're ever to be real, if we're ever to have any actual power, then it's necessary for us to follow the moral law. Now, I think this is interesting. I want to just delve into this idea of necessity a little bit more, because you might say, well, it's not really necessary. You can go about your life without following the moral law. And I think Kant's response would be, no. When you're not following the moral law, you're not living your life. Your life is being lived for you. Right? You are nothing but an effect of various causes, right? We can think about this again about our habits discussion with Aristotle. when do we really see our free will in action? Uh, how much of our lives is determined by our habits, by uh, other people, the expectations of society, of our families, uh, or by simple physical necessity. I have to eat, I have to sleep, I need shelter, I need food, I need money. Um, Whenever we're responding to those sorts of things, either the pressures of society uh, or the desires or requirements of our body, Kant thinks, we are merely part of the flow of appearances, right? Part of the great stream of nature, which is just a series of cause and effects in which we as individuals have no real power. We only have power as rational agents, and we are only rational agents when we follow pure reason and the rational law, the moral law. And so this gets to this distinction also between pure morality and anthropology. Any ethical concern that is not based in the moral law is anthropology, right? So, you know, uh, um, I can't think of a good thing to do right now. Forgive me. Okay, so let's use the most obvious example, right? You know, abortion, right? Should you have an abortion or not? Now, we could maybe apply Kantian morality here, but let's say your reason for not having an abortion is, forget that example. I'm really sorry. I should have prepared a better example. I always do my examples sort of off the cuff, and it never really works that well. Um, uh, let's say, who should you vote for? Right? It's immoral to vote for Trump, or it's immoral to vote for Biden, or whatever your arguments might be. Or should you? Man, my brain is turning off. Forgive me. Okay, let's say, should you have a genetically engineered baby? Yeah, I think that one works, more or less. Yeah, that one works. Should you have a genetically engineered baby? Right. Kant thinks there may be no rational answer to that, and therefore it doesn't matter either way. There's no moral content to it. Sorry, I'm doing a bad job of explaining this. My notes are all over the place. But in general, sort of all the things that we think of as ethics, right? It's wow, really blanking on this. God. Let's think about it this way. For Kant, anything related to your happiness is about anthropology, not morality. For Kant, happiness is not the object of morality. Morality and the moral law are not here to make you happy. And any ethics or any idea of an obligation that is aimed at your happiness or anyone else's happiness is not actually ethics. So let's go all the way back to the Euthyphro. Okay? And we ask, right, if your father murders someone, should you turn him in? And Plato gave us this very nuanced sort of thought experiment, ethical dilemma, and we can think about it from both a Aristotelian or a utilitarian perspective and say, well, it really sort of depends on the situation. Who is the person that your father murdered? What's your relationship with your father like? There are all kinds of ways that we could think about what the best thing to do is in that situation. But whatever we are thinking about, or especially if we say, that let's say I don't turn my father in, right? I decide that it's more ethical to not turn my father in. I would do that just for my happiness. And we might say that that's ethical, right? Because maybe ethics means producing the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. And well, that guy's already dead anyway. He didn't have any family. No one's going to miss him. So what's really the problem? And if my father goes to jail, that's going to make me miserable. That's going to make him unhappy. And so, generally from a utilitarian perspective, maybe it's better to not turn my father in. We might also say, something like, well, my father did the right thing. He, tried to, in the Euthyphro example, he was trying to do the right thing and it had a bad consequence. The guy died, but it wasn't his intention. And therefore we shouldn't blame him. We can let him go on this one, right? He was trying to do the right thing, and that's all that really matters, right? And so what that he died. All of those things are, not just based in the particular, but are based in the, happiness of individuals. What's going to make us happy? In general, thus far in the semester, we've thought about ethics as a kind of system for making yourself happy. With Mill and with Aristotle, that happiness is not just about the individual, but about the city, right? About society and the community. But in general, right, the kind of good that ethics aims for is a good that is happiness. It's what both Mill and Aristotle say at the very beginning, right? What are we aiming for if not happiness? Happiness is the only thing that is good in itself. It's the only thing that makes any sense as the goal of ethics. So Kant is saying, no, happiness is not the point. Morality shouldn't be about your happiness. Morality is about doing what is right, doing what is right in all cases. So forget happiness. This is about the law, right? Never pull the lever to kill somebody. And, if the moral law dictates it, turn your father in, regardless of how unhappy that will make you. Certainly, in all of those cases, the case of the train tracks and utilitarianism, or Euthyphro father prosecution, they're anthropological, right? What you choose to do in those situations is going to be based in your culture, right? Would your culture approve of you turning your father in, or would it shun turning your father in? Would your culture permit you to, flip the lever? Almost everything that we're concerned with is anthropological. Should you go to college? Should you eat meat? Should you get married? How many people should you marry? Etc. Should you have sex before marriage? These are all anthropological concerns that have nothing to do with morality. And so I think, what's interesting here is that Kant is, in one sense, an absolutist, right? There is a moral law, and that moral law is universal. But at the same time, by saying that so much of what we call ethics is actually just anthropology and has no moral content. He's also advocating a kind of cultural relativism, right? So, we would even say, is it unethical for women to not be allowed to drive, as it was until recently in Saudi Arabia? Or is it unethical for women not to be able to vote, as was the case until 1919 in this country? No, I'm sorry, 1920 is when it was ratified. Kant will say these are not ethical questions. These are anthropological questions. And working out those questions is about deciding, what kind of culture you want to live in. They have nothing to do with the moral law. Although, actually, I think probably the example of allowing women to drive or women to vote would be a problem for Kant. You'd have to allow everyone to vote, sort of in the fullest version of this. But the point is that there is no sort of cultural practice that is good or bad. There are acts that are aligned with or out of line with the moral law. And the moral law is all that we're concerned with. Only after we have the moral law can we even begin to think about anthropology. So let's get into the sort of building blocks of Kantian ethics, because I'm just blowing through time here. Kant says the consequences of your action are not important, right? The only thing that matters is the motive, what he calls the goodwill. The only way to know if you are a good person or not, if you're moral or not, is if you have a goodwill. If you do things with the intention of following the moral law, right? Doesn't matter what you do, and it certainly doesn't matter what the consequence is, as long as you do everything you do with a goodwill. Now, this is interesting, and I think we can relate it back to Aristotle also, that the motive is more important ultimately than the act. So it's sort of the reverse of Aristotle, right? For Aristotle, the act is the most important, but the motive is extremely important. For Kant, the act is important, but what's most important is the motive. On page 3, he says, for something to be morally good, it isn't enough that it conforms to the moral law. It must be done because it conforms to the law. It must be done because it conforms to the law. Right? It's not enough that it conforms. It must be done because it conforms. An action that isn't performed with that motive may happen to fit the moral law, but its conformity to the law will be chancy and unstable, and more often than not, the action won't be lawful at all. Now, what that means is that the real purpose of morality is about your motives and intentions, right? That just doing things that you know to conform to the moral law is not enough. You have to do it because you want to do it, because you will that moral law, right? And that goes back to this business of being real, being an actual autonomous rational agent. That's an important Kantian phrase that he doesn't really use specifically in this text, but has been used ever since Kant as sort of the tag for his concept of what the true human being is. An autonomous rational agent is one who not only acts according to the moral law, but wills themselves to act according to the moral law, wants to act according to the moral law. And why is it so important to have this goodwill? Because if you don't do it because you want to, but only because you know that it does, or by accident your action conforms to it, then you aren't willing yourself to be a cause, to be free. Instead, you are, again, just an object, right? You're being affected by something. Someone tells you, don't lie, and then you don't lie. Because maybe you're afraid of being punished for lying. In that case, you are acting as a consequence of someone else's action. You're not acting as an autonomous agent. Right? You aren't willing yourself to do it for your own reasons. And that's really the heart of being ethical, to will the good for its own sake. On page 5, he reiterates, right? Nothing in the world or out of it can possibly be conceived that could be called good without qualification except a good will. Right? The only thing that is good without qualification is the good will. Again, on page 5, and so this hopefully Kant will help me out here finding an example, but all of those ideas of ethics that we have seen in Aristotle and in utilitarianism, we saw Mill criticize the virtues, right? But Kant is doing that too, right? So, and here's where we get this on page 5. Moderation in emotions and passions, self-control, and calm deliberation not only are good in many ways, but seem even to constitute part of the person's inner worth, and they are indeed unconditionally valued by the ancients. Yet they are very far from being good without qualification, good in themselves, good in any circumstances. For without the principles of a good will, they become extremely bad. For example, a villain's coolness makes him far more dangerous and more straightforwardly abominable to us than he would otherwise have seemed. Right? So, a moderate, self-controlled villain is a more effective and better villain from an Aristotelian perspective, but from Kant's perspective, that doesn't matter, right? Because all that matters is your will, and that you are willing the moral law. So let's get into this moral law, a law that is stripped of everything empirical, and which has no traces of anthropology. That is to say, it's not motivated by any cultural beliefs. And therefore it will be universal and applicable in all cultures and all historical periods. And finally, a moral law that is that can be willed based on pure reason alone. Right? That is purely rational. A moral law that is not about your happiness. Now, this moral law Kant calls the categorical imperative. And the categorical imperative has two forms. The first form is to act only according to that maxim which you could will to be a universal law. Or put more simply, do what can be universalized. Do that which you would want every person in every situation to do. So, for example, the utilitarian train tracks example, that can't be universalized. You can never say, I wish everyone in every circumstance would kill someone. Right? Only do that which can be universalized. The second form of the categorical imperative is treat others as ends in themselves and never as a means to an end, and never only as a means to an end. Right? This is a point that someone was recently making to me. Very important, right? Treat others as ends in themselves and never as a means, never only as a means to an end. So these are the two forms. Do what is universal, do what is universalizable, and treat other people as ends in themselves. Those are the two forms of the categorical imperative, meaning that the moral law can be expressed equally in both of those expressions, that these two expressions work together. They mean essentially the same thing. And that's interesting, right? So when I was equivocating about the women driving or having the vote example, we can see why Kant would say maybe that's not anthropological, but based in the moral law, right? To give people the right to vote, to give people the right to drive, is to treat them as ends in themselves, right? To allow them to pursue their own ends, to give them the freedom to do what they choose to do as the autonomous rational agents that they are. So to prohibit someone from pursuing their own ends is to use someone as a means to your own ends rather than an end in themselves. Now, before we get into any more specifics of the categorical imperative, and obviously this is going to spill into our next lecture, and we'll talk about it more in class also. But let's distinguish the categorical imperative from another kind of imperative, what Kant calls the hypothetical imperative. Right? And the distinction between the categorical and hypothetical imperative is very similar to the distinction between pure morality and anthropology. Right? So a hypothetical imperative is something that you do in order to achieve something hypothetically. Right? If I do this, I think I might get that. If you go to school, you'll get a degree. If you get a degree, you'll get a job. If you get a job, you'll get money, right? These are all hypotheticals. I mean, strictly speaking, right? They're pretty good bets, but they're hypothetical. They aren't necessary. There's no, necessary law saying that if you get a degree, you'll get a job, right? Certainly not. They aren't necessary in the same way that, the law of gravity is necessary or something like that. So, the hypothetical imperative is, again, oriented toward your happiness. I'm going to do this in order to get something else, for the sake of something else. Right? We've seen this in Aristotle, we've seen this in Mill. Anything that you do for the sake of something else is hypothetical. The categorical imperative, by contrast, you do for its own sake. Again, just like in Aristotle and Mill, you do that which is good in itself. Not good for the sake of something else. But for Kant, what is good in itself is not happiness. Happiness is something that you want to attain through hypothetical imperatives, right? If I do this, I'll be happy. For Kant, that is concerned with the realm of appearances. It's concerned with consequences, and it's not the ultimate goal. Rationality isn't concerned with your happiness, right? Morality is not concerned with your happiness. So it's a categorical imperative because it is not for the sake of something else. Right? Pretty much everything that we've seen in ethics thus far, Kant would say, is based on hypothetical imperatives, right? Do that which produces the greatest amount of happiness, right? Which will effect the greatest amount of happiness. Same with Aristotle, right? Do that which will cultivate good habits and produce happiness. All that is hypothetical. All that is anthropological. And for Kant, you do that which is good and you do it because it's good in itself. You don't worry about the consequences, and you don't bother with whether or not it makes you happy. So this, Kant says, is the reason why many people come to hate ethics, hate morality. It produces what he calls here misology, right? A hatred of reason. Because reason tells us what the moral law is, and we realize that we have a duty and obligation to follow the moral law, regardless of whether or not it makes us happy. And therefore, we hate reason. We develop this misology. So, the hypothetical, in addition, is based in the particular. Right? A hypothesis is singular. I hypothesize that when I do this, X, Y will happen. Categorical imperative is categorical, meaning that, as its definition states, it should be done. It is an imperative in every case, categorically, within every example of the category of being human. Right? You have to do this to follow this imperative. All right, so we're almost out of time, but let's give an example of the categorical imperative. For Kant, the best example of a categorical imperative, something that is good in itself and which every person in every instance should do, is, as he puts it here, to not make false promises or to not lie. So I'll give a little explanation of how this meets the criteria of the categorical imperative, and then we'll call it a day. Why is lying, or rather, why is not lying, why is truth-telling something that can be universalized and which treats people as ends in themselves and never as means? Well, it has to do with the nature of lying and the fact that lying cannot be universalized. It has to do with the rational structure of the lie, that it cannot be universalized, right? Remember, again, you don't tell the truth or not lie because it's going to make people unhappy or because it's going to cause societal breakdown or because it's going to make you happy or get you anything. You don't lie simply because lying cannot be universalized, and therefore it is irrational, right? Because rationality is universal, pure, absolute. Why can't lying be universalized? Because lying assumes that everyone is, for the most part, telling the truth. I'm only able to lie because people assume that I'm telling the truth. And people assume that I'm telling the truth because people generally tell the truth. And the lie flies under the radar. If I were to will that everyone in every case lied, it would no longer be possible to lie. If everyone were always lying, no one would believe anything anyone said. And so the lie wouldn't work. Right? The rational structure of the lie makes it impossible to universalize. If everyone always lied, no one would ever believe the lie. In order for the lie to be a lie, it has to be believed. right? So structurally cannot be universalized. On the contrary, truth-telling can be universalized, right? It's possible to always tell the truth. That fits in with the rational structure of reality. And so the rational structure of the moral structure of truth-telling fits in with the rational structure of reality. It's possible to universalize truth-telling. And therefore, we can say that truth-telling is a moral law because it's in conformity with the rational law. And so the moral law is that which is conforms to the rational law. Yeah. But it also satisfies the second expression of the categorical imperative, that I treat people as ends in themselves and not as means to an end. When I lie to somebody, I am using them in a sense. I want them to believe something that is to my benefit. I want them to believe something that helps me. I'm therefore using that person as a means to my own ends. And by denying them the truth, I'm depriving them of knowledge that they need in order to act as their own autonomous rational agent, to act as an end in themselves, to pursue their own goals. I'm depriving them of the information that they need to make a rational choice. So, right, lying, or rather truth-telling, satisfies both forms of the categorical imperative and is therefore part of the moral law. I'll just mention quickly, right? The other things that Kant is talking about in this essay that are included in the moral law are well, no, we'll leave that for another lesson. So next class, we will talk more about the categorical imperative, more about hypothetical imperatives, and a lot more about duty. And then we're also reading that second Kant essay, which is on the syllabus. But so for today, the things to really, I think, take in are the distinction between anthropology and pure morality, the distinction between hypothetical and categorical imperatives, and the two forms of the categorical imperative, how they are connected, these two forms, and then to grasp the way that the lie illustrates that it is immoral by virtue of it being rationally, structurally impossible to universalize. All right, until next time.